Well, hello there again, gang. We are now talking about the rise of modernity, modern philosophy, and Francis Bacon as an Englishman credited as being the architect of modernity. So I'm going to read this quote. It's from a 1800s era biography of the guy, but you can grab your own copy via Kindle, Amazon, whatever. One of them, he's a very interesting fellow to read a biography about. I have not read this one, but I've read a biography written about the guy, I think from the 60s, but it's been a number of years. Deeply fascinating individual, and if you ever have to do some sort of biography or biography-related project, Francis Bacon is an excellent person to look into. Very colorful individual, very sassy. He was homosexual and sort of openly so, living in his era, which is he's a contemporary of Shakespeare, and he's very much out and about within society, and a lot of people that back then just sort of looked the other way and did their own thing. But it was also England. It was a Protestant nation, and I think I mentioned in the last couple presentations that England's a little bit more forward thinking than its continental counterparts. But anyway, I'm going to read through the quote. Bacon's influence in the modern world is so great that every man who rides a train, done that, send a telegram, never done that, but the modern version would be like sending a text, bloop, bloop, bloop. Follows a steam plow, don't use those anymore, but you know what John Deere's are, right? Tractors. Sits in an easy chair, I do that daily, and crosses the English Channel or the Atlantic Ocean, done that, but never in a boat. Eats a good dinner, definitely done that. Enjoys a beautiful garden, working on that at this very moment, or undergoes a painless surgical operation. Definitely have tried to do that. I think a lot of people are very thankful. You owe something to Francis Bacon because of his works. And what he talked about all gave rise to these sorts of things in terms of, he didn't invent anything, but he did say, hey, we should do something like this. He actually does invent a couple things, but not directly. We'll talk about that momentarily. So who is he? Francis Bacon. He was alive, like I said, 1561 to 1626, contemporary of Shakespeare, Elizabeth I, as well as James I, who was King of England. He was also King of Scotland beforehand. We'll talk about that in a moment. Okay, so what is he? He is a philosopher, a statesman, a scientist, a lawyer, an orator, and an author. He sounds an awful lot like Cicero, except Cicero probably didn't have a whole lot of science street cred. Francis Bacon's definitely dabbling in all sorts of things. When it came to like my own reading, I remember doing. I had to take a Latin composition class in college, and the professor made us translate some essays of Bacon. It was actually where I first really got into Bacon, and I'm just, even though it's Old English, it lends itself to Latin translating really, really well because of how it's set up, if anybody knows anything about the language. But you read his philosophy, because it's outlined, his ideas are outlined pretty well in his essays, and you're like, oh, well, he might actually be a very interesting guy. And so I've sort of been fascinated by him ever since, and that was some 20 years ago-ish. Okay, he may have originated like the real version of the scientific method. We talked about it when we talked about Epicurus. We talked about it with Heraclitus a little bit, but this guy's actually putting it out there. This is what needs to be done for science. This is a methodology, and he's laying the foundation for what that's going to become. He's also been attributed with the idea of treating the idea of an encyclopedia, which you guys don't necessarily have anymore, but like when I was a kid growing up, if I had to look something up for like a book report, I had to go to this 1960s era encyclopedia set that my mother had bought many years before, and like look up Vietnam War, which is really funny looking up in the 1960s era encyclopedia. But the counterpart, of course, or like the great grandchild or whatever of the encyclopedia is Wikipedia. which I'm sure a lot of you are using very, very often, and hopefully not plagiarizing anything. But anyway, that's Francis Bacon too. Because he's an Englishman and because he is Protestant, just because he was gay does not mean he wasn't religious. In fact, he was, and he reconciled it just fine. He was able to reject Aristotle completely. He did not like Aristotle, and I think a lot of people in my class have also, like, I know I've colored Aristotle poorly. But, there's a reason why. You have these guys that come after who, roundly reject Aristotle, and Bacon's one of them. He's also considered the father of empiricism. We're actually going to talk about a sub-school of philosophy called empiricism. And what that was, it says you have to rely on observation and data gathered in a methodical and pure way, an objective way. And so that, that becomes empirical evidence, which is what, like our court system relies on, as well as our scientific community relies on. Speaking of court systems, like I said, essays, a lot of stuff. The thing I want to talk about the court systems is Francis Bacon's his essays concerning jurisprudence. Jurisprudence is just, the wisdom of the legal system, almost literally. So, two big things that Bacon proposes. One is that in a court case, you can cite previous decisions. Now, you think, what? But think about that last time you watched Law and Order, which I think a lot of people do. You have that Sam Waterston character saying, I object, Your Honor, based on Hendricks versus State of New York, 1942, blah, blah, blah. Okay, that's Francis Bacon. He's the one that said, yeah, you should totally be able to do that because that stuff has been recorded. It's on the books. The judge decided what it was. You should be able to just say, hey, this has already been decided. Allow me to do my thing. And, of course, that's very much integral to our legal system. The other thing is legal briefs. So of all the court cases that we have briefs, especially like the major cases. So like one of the major cases would be like Brown versus Board of Education, right? You can go back and look at a synopsis of what was going on during that court case. And look at the decision. Of course, like our Supreme Court has like they render decisions, and you have like the majority opinion, and then you have the minority or dissenting opinion. And so, like our notorious RBG Ruth Bader Ginsburg might pen a dissenting decision, and all this stuff, it would be like a part of this legal brief and summed up, and then you could go as a lawyer or a legal assistant or something and go and look at what this is, because not everything has been made into law, but courts have interpreted, judges have interpreted, juries have interpreted the law in such a way that, there's precedent for it. And who do we have to thank for that? Sir Francis Bacon. All right, what about medicine? Like I said, if you ever had a surgery, well, he's the guy that says, sterilize stuff. Because back in the day, we're talking about the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. They were still like bleeding, pricking people and bleeding them as a form of treatment. So imagine that, plus dirtiness and disease. Yeah, stuff was gross. Okay, Francis Bacon's like, let's not be gross when it comes to medicine. We can be gross in other things, but when it comes to medicine, let's not be gross and keep on rocking and clean, sterilize. Like you see on some movies, like that take place back then, like they'll put some sort of like wine or alcohol or whatever on a wounds to sterilize. Like he's saying, like, you're gonna operate, do that, and of course that helps prevent infection. Okay, he has significant contributions to politics. He served under Elizabeth. She kind of got tired of him because he was obviously very opinionated. He had a lot of personality, very sassy, and I think she just said, all right, dude, go away. And then he comes back. There's actually the Mary Queen of Scots that serves as queen in between. Of course, the English get tired of her. James V of Scotland, who's her son, he agrees to convert to Protestantism, the Anglican Church, and he's now the King of England. Like I said, King James, this is where you get the King James Version of the Bible, and divine right, which I have here in the second bullet. So I'll go ahead and talk about that one first. He was a defender. He may have put the bug in James' ear about this idea of a divine right, somebody who's ordained by God to rule over his subjects in a very, religiously or instituted way. Like, I'm the king because God made me king. Shut up, go away. That's what he wrote about. Also, he has his own take. We talked about Thomas More last time around. Thomas More proposed a sort of communistic utopian society that existed in the South Atlantic. He goes his own way. He says the new Atlantis. So he's definitely taking a page from Thomas More and being like, nah, and doing his own thing. And his utopia, which actually is closer to what I think Plato's Callipolis was. But, he's doing his own thing about it. Sorry, children talking in the background. And let's see here. Everybody just sort of sits around and gains knowledge. Not quite sure how the bills get paid or how people get fed, but it's all about gaining knowledge. Of course, he's much more practical about it. Okay, so we have Bacon's epistemology, right? Bacon's epistemology is... I'm trying to back up from the camera these days, so I keep booming the microphone. He believed in a certain type of learning. He said that he's taken up, like he said, Michel de Montaigne was an influence of his. The essay form was something that Montaigne had engineered and come up with, and he's taking off with because, he has a whole book of essays. He's also against that religious academic thing, which unfortunately still sort of pervades colleges and universities today. But he says, no, man, we need to, by adhering to everything that came before, it does not allow us to come up with something new. So he calls us a disease of learning. He wants us to get rid of stuff that doesn't really apply, doesn't work, which would, for him would be Aristotle, and says, you know what? Let's go forward. Let's find something else. Let's come up with something else. And Bacon's rejection, he's not fully rejecting Aristotle. Not fully. He's not fully saying, of course, he's, Socrates and Plato were very important for him, but he's like, we have to do something new, which is important because for really up until this point, we're almost 2,000 years removed from new philosophy, purely new philosophy. He's instrumental in what that's going to do. All right. So we have his distempers of learning. He has these three types of bad learning. Pseudoscience, what he calls fantastical learning, stuff like phrenology, where you feel the bumps on someone's head and it's supposed to tell you about them. Astrology. People talking about anti-vaxxer, flat earth. Anyway. Also, contentious learning. He's throwing Aristotle under the bus because that's his jam. He wants to say that, you don't just sit around and stare at your belly button and talk about a cosmos that you have no understanding. You try to aim for something new and really, truly explain it. The cosmos is not made of flat discs. That's absurd. So come up with something new. And if you can't come up with something new, then you don't talk about it. Delicate learning, as in reproduction, just regurgitating the classics, which that was philosophy. You talk about Aquinas. Aquinas was essentially just a regurgitation of Aristotle with a Christian spin. So he's saying that's delicate learning. It's just a regurg. All three stifle true learning, so don't do it. De Dignitate, nice Latin title for you. He's classifying knowledge into history, poesy, like the arts, and philosophy. And of course he treated philosophy with the utmost regard. Okay, that's we're not going to do this quite yet. But we do need to talk about Thomas Hobbes. Speaking of the textbook, Thomas Hobbes had more to do with our textbook and is his work called The Leviathan, which I've put right here. It gets mentioned more. People talk about it. It's one of those, other than The Prince, you have The Leviathan. These books are definitely foundational in political science, political philosophy, and would be for a long time. So he's an Englishman. He actually served as Bacon's secretary for a little while. Like I said, he's right up there with Machiavelli, Thomas Hobbes, Leviathan. He wrote about history. He's riffing on what Bacon had already talked about, although Hobbes is a bit more into mathematics than Bacon was. He's also talking, I guess Bacon does talk about ethics in his essays and his New Atlantis and a couple other things, actually. Anyway, Leviathan. This is a big one. We're going to save the real conversation about this phrase until later when we talk about a guy named John Locke, who's coming up soon. But it's Thomas Hobbes who really coins the expression social contract theory. And this is huge. It's probably why he gets a little bit more play, even though you don't really you take everything else that Bacon did for granted. Social contract theory is this. As a human being born in nature, you're essentially completely free. If you want to go up and smack somebody in the face and take their lollipop, that's what you do. Except you don't. Why? You don't do that because you don't want the same thing to be done to you. So we establish governments. We have civilized society, right? And in a civilized society, we trade. Like, you think of a big bowl of M&Ms. The government wants all of your green and orange M&Ms. You get to keep the rest of them, but everything else belongs to them. Those M&Ms that you're giving away represents your freedom. You're giving up certain rights, like the right to just take what you want in order for you to be protected and take what you want. And of course, there's more to it than that, and the government gives you more in exchange for other rights, and it's called social contract theory. So if you, in college, if you don't hear this phrase again, I'd be very, very surprised. Let's see here. Let's go to this next one. He wrote about the construction of the nation state, which is also very, very significant. The nation state is something we take for granted. People get super fascinated with genealogy, even I've done my own genealogical research for my own family, and you can find out you're English or German or Welsh or Japanese or Indian or whatever. But you have to understand those nations didn't really exist until more recently. There were kingdoms, definitely kingdoms, but there's more to it than that. And just in the 1800s is really that sort of just takes flight, and you have nations, and of course when we have World War I, World War II, you have nations, and that's why after World War I, you don't have the Ottoman Empire anymore. You have the nation of Turkey, because that was just what everybody did. And of course, going back to James I, championing the rights of the monarch, the divine right. That's what it was all about. And of course, Thomas Hobbes would have rubbed some elbows with James I as well. And that's it. Leviathan, big deal. How about that? We're done with Bacon and Hobbes, not to be confused with Calvin and Hobbes, which is a shame. You should check that comic strip out. It's a classic. Anyway, if you have any questions, drop me a line. Otherwise, we are finished. See you next time around.